All right, we're sweet. All right. So hopefully this talk goes good. I'll try to not get too meta. Let's talk a little bit about acceptance testing, particularly how I learned to love it. How familiar are people here with like the concept of unit, integration, and acceptance tests? Like raise your hand if you're really confident you know what those are. Okay, so I'll be sure to kind of explain a lot of these terms as we go along. So we'll not be like super in-depth technically. There will be some code examples, but it's more kind of a philosophy and why I think it's really important to write acceptance tests and how valuable they are. So my name is Jason Carter. I'm the software engineering team lead at MavenLink. I actually have a long history with Church State and DevPoint. I was in the second class at DevPoint. I hung these lights, so it's actually really cool to be back in this classroom and you know, seen a bunch of people kind of continue along. I joined MavenLink about a year and a half ago, and we're an extreme programming shop. And what that really means is that we do pair programming, test-driven development, and really cool pipe videos on our website. So I mean, look at all this collaboration and walks and stuff. It's pretty cool. This is our San Francisco office. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, check out mavenlink.com/engineering. So I want to tell a quick story about myself and sort of this is kind of a little bit about my journey at the company and kind of things I've learned along the way. So when I first started at MavenLink, this was me kind of new to the world. I had one development job before, not really a huge focus on testing there, kind of just sort of do it as you go, if at all. And so when I heard about test-driven development coming to MavenLink, I kind of knew a little bit about it. So the basic principle is that you write a failing test that describes something that you're trying to do. So I click this widget and something happens, right? And then you make the test pass, and that tells you you're done. And then you can refactor it with confidence and like change it up because your test will still pass, right? So pretty cool. So for me, I immediately jumped to, that must mean that you write unit tests and implement it, right? So unit tests was a good start for me. It gave me confidence that my class or my object worked as I expected. So kind of to talk a little bit about unit tests really describe a small object. So you can imagine that you have like a calculator class. And a unit test for that would be like if I call multiply on the calculator with 2 and 6, I get 12, right? So it's just very simple tests, like a little piece of behavior in a single class. So that was pretty cool. I kind of started getting the hang of it, but there's a bit of a problem there. And that's, a lot of times I'd write this huge suite of unit tests that were really helpful. I knew that my thing was working, but it didn't really work very well with the other things that I had in the system. So maybe my calculator didn't work well with my, other widget, other class that I'd written, right? So I learned about integration tests, and I got better at writing them. So an integration test is designed to give you confidence that your classes work together as you expect, and your system kind of works the way that you expect. So an example of this might be, if I call this action on a model or like do some user flow, all these other things happen. A lot of times you can actually exercise the system, or you can just use mocks to kind of ensure that things get called. So a mock is a way for you to like assert that something happened without actually needing to like go through. So a good example of this is if you ever work in a system that uses delayed job or sends mailers, an integration test like makes sure that when you do this thing, the mailer goes off, the delayed job goes off, and all these other pieces work together in harmony. So oftentimes we'll exercise multiple classes at once. So this was pretty cool. Like I felt a little bit more confident, things were going well. So I ran into yet another problem. And that was this. You're told to build a swing. Your project sponsor, say your customer, has an idea of how the swing should work. The request kind of turns into something else. Your architect designs this cool thing. The engineers build a thing. But the customer didn't want to do this, right? This wasn't something that actually was useful, or it didn't do the job, right? Like everything worked together, but it wasn't acceptable to the customer. So it led to this question. How do you make sure that you're building the right thing and that it works? So I thought about it for a while. You know, I'm kind of, again, new to testing, and I ended up really coming to this conclusion, like, not my problem. I'll let the team lead and the PM deal with that, or let QA deal with that, right? So fast forward to about a year, and I am the team lead now. And so I'm doing my first big project. It was a proofing integration for one of our customers. The idea is that you could upload an image and review it and say, yeah, this is good to go. Like, this logo is ready to be used. And I kind of ran into this a little bit. It was really stressful. We were kind of spending a lot of time working on things. We would get rejections a lot in the QA process. And I didn't really know what to do. I wasn't really sure, like, how, you know, this is my first big project, not sure how to manage this type of thing, until one of my engineers on the team actually kind of told me, hey, why don't we start with an acceptance test? So the idea was, you know, I wanted to let people on my team decide what to do and you know, suggest ideas, and this was what we came up with, sort of a way to avoid this. So I kind of knew what acceptance testing was at that point. But for those who are unfamiliar, let's look at a formal definition from the International Software Testing Qualifications Board. So this is a bit wordy. Formal testing with respect to user needs, requirements, and business processes conducted to determine whether or not a system satisfies acceptance criteria and to enable the user, customers, or other authorized entity to determine whether or not to accept the system. Here's sort of my definition of it, really. Is a test that must pass for the user story you're working on to be complete. So your feature is not working, it's not built as designed until this test is passing. You can quote me on this. I kind of combined a bunch of different people into one. But look up more about acceptance testing and kind of definitions. And so Maven Link, like I mentioned before, is an extreme programming shop. That's our methodology. And it turns out, oh, this is totally part of extreme programming. So, you know, it wasn't nothing new under the sun. This is sort of an example of the feedback loop for extreme programming. You have a release plan, an iteration plan. They actually recommend that you write all your acceptance tests up front before you begin work, which we haven't really gotten to that point, but that would be something to experiment with. And then, of course, your stand-up, working with your pair, unit testing, pair programming, and writing code, right? I also learned that acceptance test was not the original name for this style of testing in this particular methodology. It was changed from functional tests to better reflect the intent, which is to guarantee that the customer's requirements have been met and the system is acceptable. Cool. So, you know, some of you may be thinking something right now, and isn't that what QA is for? And I would say that's not really a great attitude to have or a great way to look at acceptance tests. First off, they have better things to do. They're specifically really good at finding edge cases, like things that you never would have thought of. And so, you know, that's something that I think is a lot more valuable. They're great at identifying wonky behaviors. So something feels off, right? Like you're a developer, you don't give a shit. You're just building code. But a QA, a good quality assurance engineer, will give you good feedback on how the thing feels. I would say they should be your last line of defense. A lot of people treat QA as like, well, we'll just shove it over there, and if there's problems, they'll send it back to us. I don't think that's very effective because this will, you know, acceptance tests and rethinking this relationship will help you to avoid a lot of this. Works on my machine. Well, that's not very helpful. Lastly, something of value for the developer in this is that an acceptance test tells you when you're done with your feature immediately. You're not going to always get it right. You know, there will still be times where you'll do something and will get rejected. But now you have a much faster feedback loop without having to wait for it to go to QA and come back. So with this, the pattern for test-driven development becomes write the acceptance tests, know when the feature is done, test drive the implementation of that feature with unit integration specs, and refactor a lot safely knowing that the feature still works the way that it should. In fact, I have found that my acceptance tests are the first to fail and show me something's wrong, even if all my unit integration tests are passed. So, how do we accomplish this in a Rails app? There are a lot of different test frameworks out there, but in particular, we use RSpec and Selenium. So usually, people have pretty strong opinions on Selenium and working with it. One of the opinions I've seen is that it should be used as kind of a last resort. I think that's incorrect. I think that it often gives you the most confidence and is a great way to let you know that again, your feature is done and working as you expect. We've kind of walked into this. That's QA's job. A lot of companies will have actually QA automation engineers where their whole job is writing like giant automated test suites. And again, I think that that is a valuable thing, but why can't you write it? You know, it's something that will tell you when you're done and allow them to focus on maybe testing stuff that wasn't as well tested in the past. It's brittle. It fails for no good reason. This is actually a pretty valid one, I would say. But there are ways that you can kind of get around that. There are certainly things that make any kind of testing non-deterministic where it will fail occasionally. I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that I've noticed and how to avoid that. I had a particularly different opinion on Selenium, and that was just, I hated it. I absolutely hated Selenium. I thought writing it was horrible. I hated how long it took to do. I just could not stand it for some of those reasons. And so when my team approached me and said, let's do this, I was like, okay, cool, but I'm gonna work with you guys to make this palatable to me. I want this to be a lot more fun and a lot easier to understand and write. And I kind of had a secondary goal. Now let's make this a lot easier for product and QA to understand as well. Ideally, an acceptance test could be read by product and QA, even if they don't have great programming skills. And that's something we're still working on. We had this team goal to have Tiffany, our QA, pair with us on acceptance tests. We haven't been super great at that, but that is something that we're working towards. So I'm going to talk about a few general principles I think are important for acceptance testing. Avoiding intermittent failures, so tests that seem to break for no reason. And then I'm going to go through a couple iterations on acceptance test design. So the first is just like, what does a Selenium acceptance test look like? The second is sort of dividing those things up into setup, actions, and assertions. And the final one is the page object pattern, which is my personal favorite. I'm also just going to have sort of some random stuff at the end that I kind of thought about Selenium in particular or acceptance tests in particular. So let's jump into principles. So don't take any of these as gospel, right? I'm still new to this. But I think an acceptance test should exercise your app to its fullest. So the huge value of this is that you are actually setting up a server, oftentimes running all of your code, actually clicking on things and being able to expose problems by doing something that a user would actually do. No user is going to call a method on something by themselves or do some chain of events, but they're going to click stuff. And so this lets you think of user behavior and also often will expose the most bugs. Avoid mocking things as much as possible. So again, one common testing pattern is to mock the boundaries between objects. So the idea there is, well, maybe I have an object that makes an API call and I want to test that. Well, I don't really want to make API calls in my test suite. So what I can do is assert that that API object was called with the right arguments. As much as possible, avoid this. It's really hard to do in a lot of testing. We actually had kind of a problem with this in our Selenium tests that I'll talk a little bit about later. Only simulate what a user could do. So don't do any weird DB actions in the middle of stuff. One of the craziest things we ever had to do was test that if a user was added to one of these reviews and then they got removed from the workspace, the project that they were in where that review was hosted, that review would behave accordingly and be deleted. And so we had to write Selenium that would go in, go to this other page, hover on the specific user, click the delete button, click the confirm button, come back, and make sure that wasn't brittle and could be done easily and effectively. It may seem like a hassle, but it's giving you much truer behavior and much, I think, more confidence. And that's sort of the final part. I guess I have one more, but that leads into this one pretty well, and that's that it should give you confidence that your app is working as it should. When we've made sweeping changes, it's often the Selenium test that will fail and tell us that something has actually gone wrong, even where our other tests missed it. And so that's a great reason to make more tests and kind of make sure that the rest of your tests will be confident as well. But a good Selenium test gives you confidence, a good acceptance test. And I think it really should be the first test that you write in the case of regression. So if you get a bug report from some user where they say, oh, I got this thing, this weird state, you should write an acceptance test that does exactly what that user did in the app to get you into that bad state. And that make sure that you can reproduce that bug over and over again. And once you have passed that test, the bug is fixed. So on avoiding intermittent failures, or as we like to call them, intermittent successes. So the idea here is this. Maybe you have a test that worked perfectly fine on your machine, but if you use a continuous integration environment like Circle CI or Jenkins where you're running all your tests, sometimes you'll get tests that will fail sometimes, and they'll run perfectly fine locally, and they'll run perfectly well the next time that you run the build. So those tests don't give you a ton of confidence. They're actually pretty pernicious because they can kind of load into this false sense of security where you see these tests fail and you're like, you know, that's a known intermittent failure. I don't really give a but it's really not high-value tests. And so Selenium has some problems that you have to keep in mind. The first is, this is generally true for anything, race conditions. So one example here recently, I don't recall if this was in Selenium, but this would apply here, is we had a test where we were creating two things and we wanted to grab the most recent one and assert that like the list was sorted correctly and you could click this thing and all this stuff. And because the server was so fast, they were being created at the same time. And so it had no real deterministic way of determining which was first and which was last. And so that was a problem. We ended up making it so that one of them would specifically be made like 50 years in the future. So if it fails in 2050, you know, we'll deal with that then. The other is explicit versus implicitly weighting. So you often have tests in acceptance specs where one of the things you might do is say, hey, I'm going to wait for, I want to click this button, right? And maybe when I click this button, I get a loading screen or something, and then another thing appears, and I want to make sure that thing appeared and loaded correctly. Well, depending on what you use in Selenium particularly, it will either wait or it will not. You can actually set, you know, wait for 10 seconds, for example. And so if you are not waiting, sometimes your test will run so fast that the loading won't be done. And so your test will fail even though that thing actually did succeed and did go through. So knowing when to actually wait and when not to wait. Another common thing is to actually assert something else about the page, and that kind of can tell you that things are good to go, and then check for the thing that you're looking for. Not scoping your finders. So this is like, you know, in Selenium and acceptance tests, you have to have some way to find an element on a page. So that might be like a button that the user needs to click in order to do an action. And so if you're too generic and you're searching for all like button on the whole page, you might find something that's not really what you expected. So you want to make sure that you're being very explicit, like within this div, I want this button to appear, or within this section, or like in this side panel, right, is what I'm looking for. Asynchronous code generally causes problems. Again, with the loading stuff, where something might not be finished, if it has to fire off a bunch of requests and get responses. So, you know, being aware of that and finding ways to wait the appropriate amount of time or remove asynchronous stuff. And then finally, mixing setup and actions together. So again, this kind of goes back to never do something that a user themselves couldn't do. So if you have a test where you might be doing like a bunch of stuff, and then you want to change the state of your test somehow, and you make like some DB manipulation in your test, that's going to be problematic because your DB might take a second, right? Or things, you know, there's a lot of variables that you can't control there. And so you might get something into a wrong state or be in the wrong state at the wrong time. And that can cause your test to fail as well. So with that in mind, you know, that seems like a lot of stuff. It's things to be aware of. I still think that the value of these is super important. So let's kind of look at some of these tests and different ways that you can write them. So the first I want to talk about is just sort of vanilla Selenium. Like this is just how you would write a basic Selenium test. It's really kind of hard to see a bunch of this stuff. But one thing I would point out is like we have these within, so we're scoping our things. But essentially, if you haven't really seen this before, like this doesn't make a ton of sense. Like it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. So you can look at the describe and the context and see like when I'm deleting a review and the user is a review creator, it can be deleted. So you know the gist of it. But you don't really know necessarily what actions are being taken here. There's a lot of like expect page to have the selector, to have this text. Like some of it reads pretty well, some of it doesn't. So this has, you know, some pros for sure. At the very least, we're avoiding intermittent failures, right? Within is a good way to make sure that you're scoping your stuff to avoid false positives. However, this has a ton of cons. I would say that a lot of these, that one actually was pretty nice. Some of the Selenium tests I've seen are really incomprehensible unless you're dev and probably only one who has context. So if you go into this feature and you want to know how it works, and you're seeing all these crazy selectors, or like someone's grabbing something by an XPath, or like doing all this weird stuff. I've even seen like JavaScript execution in Selenium where they'll just execute a random bit of JavaScript code. Like, what does that mean? It's really tough to understand. This mixes a lot of assertions and actions. So what I mean by that is, an assertion is like what your test will pass or fail on. So the assertion would be, I expect this button to be here. And then you might have like a bunch of actions and then an assertion and a bunch of actions, and you can't really tell right away which is which or what actions led to that thing becoming a problem or failing. It's really tough to create new tests immediately from this. So one of the things that is a complaint about Selenium in particular, or acceptance testing, is that it's slow. It's slow to run potentially. You know, you actually have to spin up a browser and click on stuff. You can do headless, but it's not going to run quite as fast as your regular tests. But I think the more important problem is if you're writing acceptance tests like this, it's really hard to build a new feature. You want to be able to write a test quickly so you have your failing case and you can start developing. In particular, it offends my dry sensibilities. Like I have a lot of, dry is do not repeat yourself for anyone who's not familiar. Do not repeat yourself, or don't repeat yourself. Dry. Don't repeat yourself. I get it now. God, that was good. So, but the point, you know, most of us hold our code to a very high standard, right? Like we spend a lot of time, you know, writing these really nice classes that we really like that are very single responsibility. But we kind of ignore that for our tests sometimes. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think your test should be reusable and dry as well. And this one is kind of one of my biggest complaints, is if I change the DOM or I change the layout of this page, I have to update a bunch of stuff, especially if I've been copying and pasting this all over the place, you know, because I haven't extracted it and made it dry. And that becomes really hard if you didn't know what the behavior was in the first place, what this thing was testing. Like you get into some legacy app that's been developed for, you know, 7 or 8 years, and you run into this test and it's failing, and you can't tell immediately what the hell it was trying to do. That sucks. That's like an hour or two, you know, trying to figure stuff out. At this point, people will sometimes say, well, what about comments, Jason? That would tell me what this thing was trying to do. I removed a slide that was a little bit more expletive-laden, but I really don't like comments. I think comments are another thing to keep up to date. I will concede that sometimes they're necessary, but I think a good method name is generally a really good comment. If your method describes really well what this thing is trying to do, that actually has meaning, it's code, it's executable, your IDE can find it a lot easier. And I would say, again, with an asterisk, if you need a ton of comments, chances are that method is doing a lot more than it should. And your class really should be blurping up a little bit more, or into multiple objects. That said, this is Jason's opinion. You know, don't take it as gospel. So, assuming we don't like comments, how do we make this code more understandable, particularly if our goal is to have this be something that we could have product or QA or the business read to understand what the goal of the feature is? So the first thing that we tried was the concept of separating things into setups, actions, and assertions, and giving them really nice method names. So this is the very same test that we had before with everything extracted in the comments. Or sorry, in the methods. So this is immediately, in my opinion, a lot more readable. I know that I'm navigating to a tab with this user and in this workspace. I'm going to click this proof's title. This proof should have the status of in review. I'm then going to click delete review, confirm that action by clicking the delete button. And then now I have my assertions all in a row. It has a create option. So once I delete it, I can create a new one. It persists the delete. So this one actually is pretty crazy. One of the problems that we found is this was one of our first features doing React, and so we weren't really quite confident with that whole data flow. And so we kind of just played around with getting stuff to work, and then when we started persisting, we found that the easiest way to check that as a user would be to actually close this side panel that it was in and open the side panel again and check that the thing was there, because that was actually what we were seeing in the app. was that if you close it, well, React's gone and it didn't persist the data. And all that stuff is now abstracted into this method. And at this point, we've deleted it. We persisted to delete. This is just one that's kind of gravy too. It's like, specifically, I shouldn't see this in review thing anymore. It's gone. So this one has a ton more pros. I would say it's definitely easier to read. Just plain English. There's all the Selenium and DOM manipulation stuff, all the selectors are abstracted away from you. It has reusable methods. So one of the really cool things about this is that we can now bootstrap a brand new test really easily. We know that we need to do these methods to kind of get things into a state, and then we write one more that says like, now I can't delete a review if it's been approved or something, right? And now we have used all of our setup methods before, and we're writing a new method, and we're good to go. We have our failing acceptance spec. I mentioned this already, but we've abstracted the DOM away. We don't have to think about like what CSS we are. And if we did have DOM changes and we had all these specs, we can just change the method and we're good to go. There's still some cons to this, I think. I really like it. It's a lot better, but it's not always easy to tell what page we're on. So sometimes you write these methods, you might have similar methods depending on where you are in the app. And so it doesn't give you a good understanding of where you're at in the application. I still don't think it's a great way to show that an action leads to an assertion or something you're trying to test. So you saw that there were a bunch of actions and then a bunch of assertions at the end. And I wasn't really sure, it's not necessarily clear to me which one of those led to the thing that I wanted to test. And not pictured there is our giant function library. So we've kind of separated these out into feature areas. So this was our proofs area. We have like probably a 1,000-line function library, like all these helper functions that we have that we've set up into like actions, assertions, and setup, right? Super helpful with, you can really quickly jump to definition, but that gets tough to manage. So we decided to kind of play around with the page object pattern. So the page object pattern looks a little bit like this. So this is a separate thing. We actually had an issue where we had a couple people using our project invitation form to send out spam. And so we blocked them and we decided to implement some stuff for users where they cannot do certain things. And so the page object pattern is pretty cool where you create a new page object. It's the name. So in this case, we're talking about inviting people to projects. And I want to create a form. So this is an object that encapsulates what a form is and what a form does on this particular page. So in this case, I passed it Maven, which is the team. We have the concept of mavens and clients. So if I'm signed in and I'm trying to invite people to the Maven team, that's what that does. So I log in, I visit the workspace path, I invite a team and a user, and now I can actually insert things on it. So I expect the project invitation form to have a save message as default checkbox. Expect it to have no subject and message tipsy, to have no upgrade call to action. My favorite part is down here, where I expect project invitation form dot send invitation, so I'm taking action to have sent invitation. So that's saying, okay, we successfully processed, we showed our alert, and we sent off the delayed job. Right? Super cool, in my opinion. So what a page object kind of looks like is this. Again, a little bit tough to see, I apologize. But it's just a plain old Ruby class. You include the copy bar DSL, which is a Selenium thing, and you can start defining methods, right? So initialize, has save messages default, right? It's the same Selenium stuff that we saw before at the very beginning. But now it's kind of abstracted away into this object, and each object knows what things it should care about. So a couple things to note about this pattern. The first is that it kind of relies on a little bit of copy bar magic. So you'll notice that all of my methods are like has sent an invitation with a question mark. Copy bar will actually, it has its own DSL, its own specific language. That's why you see like context and describe and it, etc. So has sent an invitation can then be referenced as to have sent an invitation. So that's like a little quirk. Additionally, in one of those methods, we return self. And the reason for that is so that we can continue to chain methods on. So I could say .click button, .do this, .do that, and then some assertion. In particular, this lends to the to syntax that we saw before. So because I've returned self, .to knows what it's calling have sent an invitation on. Super handy. especially if you want to chain a bunch of actions together or you want to do these types of assertions. So, pros of this pattern. It's much easier to tell what page we're on. In fact, that's the whole point, is you build these page objects that you can then scope actions and assertions to. Even subpages. Like, one of the things that was interesting here is that we also had this project invitation preview. So you would have the form and be able to interact with it, and it would affect the preview. So now you can create a project invitation form, take action on it, right, where you're abstracting away like the process of actually manipulating the browser, and then make assertions on your invitation that whatever you did to the form did what you expected to the preview that you see there. Super awesome. It's pretty readable. I think it lets you see cause and effect much easier, particularly if you name things very well. And maybe the best pro of all, Martin Fowler said this is awesome. So if you want to read, I'll have my slides up on GitHub. There's a link here where he talks a little bit more about the page object pattern, some of the things that he likes about it, some of the things that he doesn't like about it. Because when I came up to the con section here, I haven't really found any yet. To me, this is really, really nice. It's really readable. It kind of scratches my itch for writing good test code. And we found it fairly easy to bootstrap new stuff. You avoid the giant function library. And it's pretty cool. So let's get into some of the other musings that I have about this whole talk in general. I would love to be able to do something like this. Expect this action to have done all of these things. So you can imagine like have sent an invitation, have notified like some admin panel thing, and have done something else. I haven't really experimented with it yet. I'm sure it would probably be possible. It might require some patches to the copy bar DSL or something. What if I want to make the same assertions on multiple pages? So maybe you have behavior that you want to share between different objects. Like maybe every page you should be able to log out, or every page you can click on some widget and get something, right? We haven't really run into that because this is still pretty new for us to be doing this. This is sort of what we've arrived at and started doing in the last month or so. And so I'm assuming that you could pretty easily start sharing assertions between page objects, or even abstracting those out entirely. Maybe a page object is just something that you use to manipulate the page, and you do other things on, you have assertions somewhere else. I don't know yet. What about common tasks like logging in? So we'd already actually kind of done this for a while. We have a lot of shared actions. Like you could share actions between page objects. We actually have the maven link Selenium helpers that gives us like a couple of interesting things like log in, log out, dismiss notification. Some people had kind of put methods in their file. So, either some combination of that, maybe a thing that you could include on the page. You saw in our test, I sort of used those helpers and just kind of set things up to make sure I was at the right page before starting the page object. What about third-party integrations? So this is something that we actually ran into kind of recently, where we have a feature where we're very dependent on a third-party service, and it was often enough, it's really hard to stub out and actually get API requests to and from your test environment, a full like end-to-end integration test. And in particular for us, we were doing a lot of this stuff in delayed job. So we would have to make some call to the service to like provision a user on their database, and then get a callback back at some point that would say, okay, it's good to go. You can like let this person into our third-party library thing. And so what we would do a lot is assert that our delayed job would be called with the right arguments when we did something. But we had some problems where we didn't really know necessarily if it was doing the right thing. So if your delayed job has, it should be well unit tested, but if it has problems, you don't have a ton of confidence that it actually worked. So this is something we started recently. We're doing a big refactor on this particular domain in our app. We wrote this little helper called run concept shared jobs immediately, so that in Selenium we actually just skip delayed job entirely for certain tests. And actually just call perform. So this checks if the job has a queue name, and if that queue name is our specific type of job, we're going to perform it instead of enqueuing it. So this lets us write some tests like this that we really like, where we can mock like our actual API calls. We still haven't figured out a good way to do API calls in tests. I don't know if we really want to necessarily. But we can say like, okay, at the very least, I expect that these API methods on our client will be called when I do this action. So that's super nice. That gives us a lot more confidence in our tests. So like I said, that gets us partway there. How do I make sure that the third party does what I want? This particular third party has a history of doing some crazy stuff and releasing things that break all their partner implementations, and we're usually the ones that discover it first. So I don't have a good answer for that yet. I've kind of started looking into a thing called VCR that lets you record API responses and play those back in tests, and then you can actually, for some runs, have it go do the real API call and then come back and save that response.
That's not going to test the API.
Yeah, it will only test the response that you have. You know how to respond to. The first time you run it, it goes and actually gets a real response. So in that case, it would be testing. And so the idea that we had was maybe anytime this third party says, okay, we're going to release a thing, we could run all these tests and say, give us new responses this time and make sure everything still passes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Your actual responsibility is not to make sure that their code is doing what it should, but it still affects you.
Yeah, I mean, there's been many a day that my whole schedule's been blown up because something happened and we didn't catch it. So being able to catch it earlier would be awesome. Particularly, this is a SOAP API, and so the cassettes that you get for this are really large. And so we're still trying to figure out a good way to do this. Lastly, what if you still got the behavior wrong? And this happens. There are times where we write a good Selenium test, things are good, and it still gets rejected, it still doesn't work. So to that, I would say, clarify early on with QA and product about what things are. Make sure you have really good stories or really good tasks in Jira, what have you. And hopefully, have them take a look at your tests and make sure that you agree upon this is a good test that shows that this thing is done. You're never going to remove the need for QA. Like I said, they're great at finding edge cases, like helping you think of things that you didn't. But ideally, you doing this and clarifying this up front makes their job a little bit easier. So this all sounds long good. How do I start doing this? If I'm, haven't done this before, maybe my company isn't super into acceptance testing or testing in general. Just do it. You can tell your PM that your code's just taking a little bit longer than you thought. But write tests, I think that the value, you'll be able to develop faster. You'll be able to be a lot more confident that you're building the right thing. In fact, I jumped into my summary section before doing it. What we're doing here, what I'm going to show you is avoiding common pitfalls that make working with this stuff really painful. We're avoiding building the wrong thing. If you're very diligent about making sure that your stories are well written and that your tests help you to determine that. It serves as documentation that you have to make and you don't have to keep up to date. That's readable by all your stakeholders. It makes it easier to do sweeping refactors and maintain behavior. And I love my job a lot more now with the confidence of that. So I'm super glad we've done it. I encourage you all to do it. And now let's talk, do questions and discussion. Thank you.
What's your plans for using critical tests, right? Like that's one of the biggest problems with unit testing. You're saying if that's under review 1 to 2, some stakeholders, then we should call that under review after testing testing. What do you think of that? Like that's one of the areas of testing that you absolutely hate. That shouldn't appear if that says in review or if that's an H2 or an H3 or whatever it is. What do you think of that?
Yeah, did you have a response to that? Or?
So we're using data attributes. So if you provide data attributes on one of them, everyone kind of knows, don't change that. You're going to sputter out whatever you want with it. You take the data attribute of looking on the message for our selector instead of like
if someone switches away and the tag to a button pad or change the message because it's cheap. That's how.
Yeah, we've actually done something pretty similar for some of our code, and it's been pretty helpful. Additionally, like you try and avoid, copy bar in particular has a bunch of really good matchers that just like know defined stuff without you having to give it too much information. You're never going to really be able to avoid it. But if it's at least kind of tied into a method, we found that it's like, or a page object, it's a lot easier to be like, I'm updating this page, I better go double check that object. And then any tests that we're relying on the selector are fixed in one place.
The method, when you break methods out like that and centralize it, it certainly helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the page object model a lot. A lot of what you're doing, your way of getting there, you might be like 2012 cucumber, right?
Right.
Scenario with all these steps.
This method breaks out.
Right. Right. And that was one of those ones where cucumber was this great idea for teaching DBD, so the product and project people can read it and understand it. But it fell out of space to get so effing long and was so brittle. Right? Like everything changed. You change the standard protocol. They were really,
Well, we were doing a lot of Xbox, like selectors got so much better.
yeah.
We were reversing the call to like fill out one signature.
Yeah, it's really like, you know, the hierarchy of selectors now, like always try to go for an ID or class name. But yeah, like in that one example where we're like deleting a specific row on this table that we know is the right row, we're using XPath, and that's brittle. That's going to be a problem someday. Additionally, they have some built-in helpers that are pretty cool now. Maybe they've been around for a while, but like click button or fill in, that's really smart if you're structuring your HTML pretty well. So I think it's got a lot better. We've upgraded versions a couple times too, and that's made it a lot better. Yeah.
That's what was good. Like the only good thing in my opinion that came out of Cucumber was Hurricane. That's what I good. It was just like a combination of two things, a strategy. But they had to find features directory or whatever. That was a good day.
Yeah,
Well, also they never actually wrote for us. Like, stuff right in your story. So teach the product
yeah, we didn't really want to introduce a new tool. Like we hadn't used Cucumber. We already had Selenium. I've definitely looked at it personally and seen like kind of the potential there. A lot of us are familiar with Selenium, and we've been trying to like push these patterns to the rest of the company. It's been just copy bar Selenium, Selenium WebDriver, yeah. Yeah.
Some of what you did actually factored into
Yeah.
how the page on stuff, but that initial like all the two-step methods. That actually looked a lot like.
So really, you were trying to do BED through your method names, where steps were already doing. But in the end, you started doing that with describe context stuff.
Yeah.
Go back to your assertions of the review one.
Whew. So many slides, man. Awesome. There's one?
That's actually something I was talking about later.
Yeah. It'd probably be in here.
It was like.
It was at the page. Oh, yeah, okay. That was that was our invitation form, I think. There you go. This one? To send invitation? Or do you want to see that actual page object guy?
Let's see, what's that? Send invitation actually. Chat.
Yeah. So this one is checking that the flash message happens.
Okay, so I saw that insertion method that is who was completed. The insertion was just a message here. And then it was completed. So I think you actually want to be very careful about going down to not too far where your assertions are actually distinct from what you're actually asserting on.
Mm-hmm.
If you're asserting on the user sees a message that you're not actually asserting the fact that something was conveyed or you have to solution. You're asserting that the user sends a message that says that.
So I guess my counterpoint to that maybe is like that is the only way that the user knows, and you should try and do things that the user knows specifically. I've had problems where if I assert the database stuff specifically, that can cause problems.
I'm not telling you to assert it yourself.
Right, but some other.
User is it should show a message.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A more descriptive name for it. Yeah, that makes sense.
Specific to the assertion that you're actually
Mm-hmm.
Unless you were to load another page like an index page to show that it's no longer there. I think the context here that deletion actually happens on the third party. It's not happening. We're sending the message.
Oh no, so this is the project invitation form. I really wish DexSet didn't make this horrible color decision. So this was a different area where we did page object, so we're not constrained by that. This was our first stab at page object, and that was the easiest thing that we found to do it.
So what are your questions?
Yeah.
Where do these tests run in the context of your application? Are they within your application or separate app? We have, I think we'll talk about the pattern we're trying to use because it's really weird. You know, we created a separate application to do acceptance testing that runs a lot of stuff. So you don't have access to any models or the internals. It's strictly from outside the scope of the application. They actually created, the guys that did this actually created some controllers just used for testing. Is this part of your app, your test suite within the app?
Yeah, so we have a spec Selenium directory that we can run locally anytime. It's included in the app. It has access to everything. I think there's an argument that maybe this should not know about stuff because that prevents you from kind of cheating a little bit.
Use it as a crutch.
Yeah. It does. So we'll run locally. It's our test suite is pretty huge, so it's almost impossible to run the whole thing in a day locally, unless you like. We're trying to figure that out. But Circle runs pretty quickly on all the containers, so we have actually a Selenium container, and so we'll generally run that every time we push a build. So that's where we'll actually get the results from it. But it is part of the main repository. I think, do we use Sauce Lab for browsers a little bit?
I use it. I use it to play
They can plug right into Circle or Travis or whatever and run it in parallel next to it.
You just barely started doing acceptance testing.
We've always had acceptance testing. It was not always reached for. Like some people really didn't like it. I didn't like it. So we do, like, we're using Circle 2 now. So we do have like one container bootstraps everything. All of our RSpecs run in parallel. Selenium, I think, has one or two containers. I don't know for sure.
So your acceptance testing portion, so the Selenium directory is in the select portion.
Yeah, I would say so.
Two recommendations: ditch RSpec and parallelize that.
Yeah, I don't know our build config totally offhand. Our builds take about 30 minutes on Circle, so we do have a pretty good high degree of parallelization up there.
I have an idea. That's why I was asking about your build test stuff. Truthfully, I think you could clean up a lot of that little XGT stuff just by using locales and translation model. So that way, if you change it in one spot, it changes it over your testing. and we get rid of that whole problem entirely, right? Especially,
yeah, we don't have any locale files. We're not at all internationalized. So
right,
that
but files are just about localization.
right,
It's also just about units,
right.
Change and it goes everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Which is another perfect use case of why you might do that. You might have a
Right.
shop-level model,
That makes
but it has
sense.
something like this in it, one application that says for this project, and that one could be a variable within that. If you want 5, 10, 100, whatever. But that way, like, this right
Then
here,
it's totally seamless. You just change the locale.
this as it grows, and then you get rid of it. All in all,
Right.
Get ourselves, you know, at least everywhere I've ever done it, you know. But that way, if you just change the ones that alpha doesn't, because that's the hardest thing. That's the hardest thing about Cucumber.
Right. Yeah.
And something to consider is.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
We have some others that can get them, go to user team, resting, but it's the same way instantly. So you just don't have that stupid problem where your view code is breaking your desks. Either that be done as all ends, right? It shouldn't be breaking your code.
Just kind of an off-the-wall question. Do you write any acceptance tests to check for XSS tax sanitization?
Yeah, we actually have. I believe we did this we just did a post formatting feature where we were allowing Markdown, like a subset of Markdown in our posts on Mavenlink. And that was, of course, a huge concern is like, are we effectively stripping out, script tags, et cetera? And so I can't remember if that was something we felt comfortable accomplishing by unit testing our stripper class. We always got a kick out of that. Or if we did an acceptance test for that specifically. I don't know if Brandon remembers if we did that. Did we do?
Like one-ish, like tag general one at the acceptance level, or fine grain.
Yeah, like it does not pop alert or something. It doesn't, like you put in a script alert something and then make sure it didn't actually do anything.
You kind of touched on, but I want to reiterate, it's like, how is this, or after you push your features, you're done working on it, it's your regression suite, essentially. I mean, I think most people at that time were like, you change a line of code, you're not sure exactly what it's doing, unit test breaks, okay, so change unit test, push the code, and 2 days later, the bug report is something the user needed for that broke. And that was only unit test failed. That's what this is doing.
So the process of any regression testing workflow is going to be depends really doing like we've covered. Is that like my lunch today?
Yeah, I mean, we've always been really good at coverage at the unit and integration level.
Well, we can do an XP, it really helps.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was just sort of like, we would use these sometimes, like different people had opinions on when you should use them, and we just sort of said, whatever, use them all the time. We can always parallelize circle and get, if we're building a bunch of these tests. Yeah, we're hitting the point where like maybe that's not the right solution. So there have been things where I think we try to test mainly the happy path with the acceptance test. And we also often write like very large singular, like one test that like clicks through everything, does a bunch of stuff, rather than a bunch of tests that have to log in, do a thing, log out, log in, do a thing. We try and like exercise the whole thing in one test run.
Find that hard. Especially if it's sure it's workflow. It is hard to maintain all our apps.
Yeah.
That's actually really smart.
I think
You can actually go further over time, like smaller acceptance tests into a regression focus suite, but also very useful longer term.
I think there's something about like upkeep of your test suite too, though, right? Like, you can TV your way through anything and almost 75 assertions, but in fact, like the question for any center, right? That's what happens. It's the problem that's never come back to see it.
Plus, when you're using your test suite to document, makes it a little harder if you've got ginormous, single ginormous tabs to actually do that.
Yeah, I think this style helps with that quite a bit, and we will break things up if it does get too large. But like the concrete example where we really did this recently was in this post formatting thing, where it's like, here's this post formatting text area. Like, does bold work? Does italics work? Does underline work? Can you do links? Can you create emojis? Can you live preview these things, right? And the test itself runs really quickly because you're just like clicking a bunch of buttons and stuff, and it's all grouped together as like all the portions of it. And we could have done that as like separate tests with describes, but because the method names themselves were really obvious, it actually ended up not being a huge problem. The one downside there is like, if you want to like run the test specifically as part of your test-driven development cycle, you might have to go through all this other stuff to get to that one thing you wanted to test. But what we've actually done is sometimes we'll like comment out all the unnecessary parts and just keep the stuff that gets us going. But upkeep, I wouldn't say it's been, that bad. Especially compared to like the confidence it gives me when I'm developing. Yeah.
So what's your, this is a question for everyone, like, what's your mentality for acceptance testing? Like mine is like acceptance test key transactions, forget about the rest, and that's the problem. Key transaction would be like registration or credit card or something that a business can operate with that, right? Because to that end, to the acceptance test for every single scenario possible. You're spending 70% of your time testing, 30% of your time teaching. So that's your sales force, you can do that, But like, what other opinions are out there about this?
I feel like what's been helpful about this pattern is like every story has a representation at acceptance level. So like a story is definitely acceptance functionality, you should have an automated test around that functionality. It doesn't be like exhaustive. Like I'm going to do it every possible insight or work this in every possible way, but there's some representation of okay, like this piece of functionality works.
So let me rephrase this. And obviously, you guys are in like beginning this methodology. Right?
I would characterize it as beginning. I think day one, like they wrote an acceptance test and then wrote Railspeed, right?
Yeah, so the main change here is I think we're like page object pattern haven't been introduced, for example, I think there is a tendency for some people not to test drive with this, right? Like that's maybe the big change that we had to do was like, let's introduce these new patterns and let's make sure that we're writing the acceptance test first. Some people would add acceptance coverage. As much, yeah.
But that really gives you freedom in your unit testing because you may be less than your unit tests and like on things literally and really have fast unit tests that are small and easy to write, not in one set because it's all going to fall apart at that feature.
But consequently, also you're free to make more bold refactors in your code because you have an acceptance test you can lean on to know if you broke the user experience. If you've got good coverage. Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that occurs to me when you talk about doing the acceptance tests up front is, a lot of times when I'm doing CDCs, it helps me flesh out the actual logic for the feature that I'm working on or whatever. And if you're doing the acceptance tests up front, you pretty much have to have that. Maybe documented is the wrong word, but a lot more firm grasp of that whole functionality and how it's going to work, as opposed to building it up through TDD. Your TDD test is going to be too. So if you just start with the assertion, the description of your test, my acceptance test, it should be this user. That's all you start. You don't have to redefine all this stuff. starts with acceptances. And you're like, okay, so what am I going to insert on? Start from like the bottom of the 6 or 7 steps and build upwards instead of doing setup and then at the range, act insert order, like do insert, act range, first. Kind of build it together to sort of start with your objects together. Actually, targeted should probably use a little bit request level specs that don't exercise the UI. That's the thing that you should type for use case. So they start more at the control action level. So those run significantly faster than trying to browser. So good one.
So you saw that headless integration type testing? He's talking about just strong integration testing.
Outside integration testing, where you're not on anything other than kind of start, it's not as real as acceptance, but it's also not as significantly less possible. Especially if you guys are user volume to react from something else, like that's going to be critical kind of tests. Then you can start rating those front-end tests to be more of that user journey things that act as like error regressions.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think
you're concerned about time, but it's not even on par.
Right. Yeah, we're doing okay. We're definitely a little concerned. I think. Mhm. Yeah. We definitely have a lot of really good helpers that we built up over the years to like assert all of our APIs work, that all of our APIs like respect permissioning correctly, that things are viewable to certain people at an API level. Like typically when we're building something, we build the API first a lot of times and have this really great library of helpers and shared behaviors and stuff. And a lot of times, like, so when I'm developing locally, I'll generally run all the unit tests I can find, integration tests I can find, like first to check for regression, or to learn how something works. I really wish, like we've experimented too with like headless Selenium, like to turn like a headless mode, and it actually works okay. Like we're trying to get onto the new headless Chrome. We've like kind of played around with that on Fridays, like for project time, and that increased speed dramatically.
You're kind of stuck on that. I feel like with the JavaScript frameworks and stuff, you're kind of stuck with that.
Yeah.
But to your point about setup and understandable, that's sort of some benefit in the sense that like what I like to do is just write like those high level, like almost like Gherkin style methods first. Like if I can't write those, I don't understand enough about the story. Get into the story and realize, oh wait, what did we actually do here? So that puts that like up front. And once those methods are there, like writing enough code to support that until I get the failure aspect, then
How did you do like failures that aren't tied to business logic at all? You start with a very high level, right? I think we're going to need this and this and exist. You just have comments and send that stuff. Start driving out design. Don't think about it. It's actually very effective. You're in Java.
What? Can I read Java? A little bit, yeah. Yes, we've been reading that at work. Yeah.
It's very much talking about driving acceptance. You work to the sub-cycle of classic TV and going back up to the top and doing this multi-tier TV cycle. You also really know where you want and not want. Running object-oriented software and my tests. It's a job, but it's
There is a Ruby edition that's, I think, right? Was there Ruby? Or I'm thinking of refactoring, yeah.
So actually, the argument of examples of that.
Right.
Yeah, if
Right. Yeah.
Even though you don't maybe necessarily understand all of those, there's a lot of research about the reason why.
Yeah.
Read all these sides.
It was really hard to build up their code.
Martin Fowler hates that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, still, like, one of the things I think about when I ask you that question, like, because the reason people died in the movie community is because people started getting 300% test coverage in their app. And it became this thing of like, we're not going to see but we have this pragmatic, perfect test suite.
And change something, you grow that means your test suite is you're exercising the same code that's over and over again.
Right. So I don't know where I'm going with this, other than just like keep cognizant of that and be careful of that. Test suite that takes 30 minutes to run on a circle and doesn't run on your own machine. It's tough, man. Like honestly, like the day that there was a day when I did Cucumber and just went straight first capybara stuff. There was a day when I did RSpec and expect syntax and I like that syntax. Like it's good and I'm not saying this is a tooling choice. I'm saying the effect it had on our productivity was like, my RSpec specs, it was probably, I don't know, 3,000 insertions across 200 tests or something like that. But this one day, we're backing on the mini test. I take like 28 minutes to like 43 seconds. That's how different it was. And I was like, don't forget that. I like that shit about I like that stuff or whatever. I like all those.
I think you were just tired.
I didn't want to start an framework flame war. Yeah.
But the main point of it was, if I can't run my test suite, or if I have to rely on external services to build it, I'm highly job. And that's like exactly what Ruby's not. Like, Ruby's great for app prototyping. One of the things you can make use of is tagging strategy, where you can tag your specs, where you sort of have a set. Yeah, you have a set that you're working in a certain area. You know that you would run this certain set, and that works pretty well. And you still also have to keep in mind that there could be other things that you don't quite know about and have to tag or have some area that's a little bit further away that you might be affecting about that. Yeah. You still have to run the whole build process. That's what you can do it from the problem, right? It's a way to do it.
All that time is the acceptance test. All that time is our unit tests in RSpec that write the database, save the record, all that.
Yeah, that's why I'm curious. Most people think that acceptance tests are sweet, but not enough of them. And it's really with all the integration tests that touch databases and stuff that massive tests.
So we ran 50,000 tests, 49,000 tests.
That's just our spec too.
Yeah, that's not including gas.
I mean, a lot of our front-end marionette tests aren't. They have a view, really top of the view, it renders the view all the way down.
Yeah. So like I think we've talked a lot in Salt. Yeah, we use Jasmine. We're using Enzyme for React. Like I think for us, honestly, if we really wanted to speed up the suite, like we should. Like our acceptance test wouldn't really be the problem, I don't think. I think it would be mocking our unit a lot better. Or like our spec helper loads so much shit all at once, right? Or we like have a very heavy fixture cycle. And that, that speaks to kind of maybe the philosophy of some of our earlier engineers, like everything should be an integration test as much as possible. We're much more like exercise the feature at the right level. And so if we took a lot of time to like make more plain objects that don't have to load all of Rails to do their tests, that would be a huge win for us. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of at a point now where, like, you can see we got 16 containers. Like, our acceptance container isn't even the craziest one, I don't think. So,
That's usually about managing it.
right. It is a crying shame, though, that we can't run all of our tests locally. And that's something we've raised a lot recently, in particular, when we came on. It's like, I want to at least be able to run all my RSpec suites in like a,
Right, because this became your shared dev environment.
yeah. Wait. And that's been actually a bit of a challenge for us as we've scaled, is I think people just, like, we didn't have a ton of teams pushing code. We're getting up to like 7 or 8 teams now, I think. And so, like, this wasn't a bottleneck for us, and now it is becoming that bottleneck. And so, yeah. So, you know, still more to learn, right?
We could run like all unit tests in 2 minutes. It would tell us for sure if it works, but that'd be like really good confidence, right? And if I was here to take this test take half an hour, if all unit test passes for sure. Not.
What directories sit alongside the Selenium directory? Serious infrastructure. Is that like
Let's do a little live demo. Be sure to steal this and send it to your employers. Huh? Yeah, probably.